but lovely to see you there. We're trying to work out what you're trying to do with the BBC, or what is the problem with the BBC. How do you see that?
Well, look, the BBC is a really valued institution, but it's really important that it maintains the public's trust, particularly as it's paid for by the licence fee payer. And some audiences think the BBC is biased. Others are very, very frustrated with the complaints system. So what we've announced today is a mid-term review, which will be fundamental reforms to ensure that the BBC is more impartial, and also that those complaints are handled more independently and there's further scrutiny, so that audiences feel like their issues are being listened to.
One of the concerns that the audience seem to have is with one particular individual, and you'll know who I'm talking about, Gary Lineker, who we've ended up doing a number of ministerial interviews about, to be perfectly honest. Grant Shapps, for example, your colleague in the Cabinet, saying you should just stick to the day job. How much of a problem, in your view, is Gary Lineker when it comes to trust in the BBC?
Well, I should say, as Culture Secretary, it's really important to underline that the BBC is operationally and editorially independent, but you're obviously talking about the social media guidelines. You know, the BBC have got those social media guidelines, and what they say is that the impartiality of the BBC is really important, and I think it's really important that those who work for the BBC, and this is what the guidelines say, respect that impartiality, and that they don't undermine the reputation of the BBC. Obviously it's for the BBC and not for me to determine whether those guidelines have been crossed by any particular presenter, and it's something that I know audiences and I are monitoring very carefully.
But I'd love to know, Secretary of State, what exactly is causing offence to people, because we have to be very, very careful letting the public regulate what is broadcast, because what you get, which is the state of broadcasting in this country at the moment, is dull, bland, boring, increasingly boring broadcasting presented with people who have been dipped in disinfectant. And it's dull beyond belief. And it's not up to ministers or members of the public to dictate. Surely it's up to broadcasters to say, this is the way we see this is the way we're reporting it, now swallow it, or there's a knob, you can turn it elsewhere.
Well, what we're talking about today is the BBC, and the BBC has a particular position because it's paid for by the licence fee payer, it's paid for by the public. And therefore it has a particular duty. It's also governed by the charter that's set out by government, and this is a mid-term review in relation to that charter. Of course, as you say, you know, broadcasters aren't governed by the public, and they're certainly not governed by ministers. But the BBC is governed by Ofcom, and there are rules and regulations in relation to how it should perform and behave, and that's what we've been looking at.
The Gary Lineker issue, I mean, you talk about how the BBC is impartial and you don't have any say over what, you know, how they decide to proceed. You must have a view. I mean, clearly you can see that this is a presenter, a sports presenter, whose own tweets have now been talking about sports, specifically suggesting there should be a boycott on Israeli sporting events. How can that not be a conflict of interest and in some way undermine people's trust in the BBC? I'm not asking you to determine it, you won't get involved, but you must have a view.
Well, I must say the BBC is operationally independent in relation to this matter. As I said, the guidelines, social media guidelines, set out that presenters, those who are employed by the BBC, should not bring the BBC into disrepute. What I would say in relation to my role on this, you know, I'm looking at this very carefully. I'm looking at whether the guidelines are sufficient. I'm looking at whether the BBC is enforcing those guidelines. But the right time for me to get involved is in a charter review, and that's what I would do, having looked at these issues very carefully and monitoring what the BBC are doing.
When you watch the BBC, do you see, as a viewer, as a listener, that it has a problem?
Well, as Culture Secretary, it's my job to look at the BBC from that perspective. But look, what I'm interested in is what audiences say. And what we know from statistics from Ofcom is that audiences are feeling like the BBC is not performing that role in relation to impartiality, and they are getting less impartial. So last year, 39% of complaints about the BBC were about impartiality, when the year before they were 19%. So trust in the impartiality of the BBC, unfortunately, is going down. It's really, really valuable institution. We should hold the BBC in high regard, but it's got more to do, and that's what this report is all about.
And I presume, Secretary of State, when there are complaints about impartiality, they would mostly, by far and away, be about news broadcasting.
Yes, so a lot about, you're right, this is largely about news, but there are issues that are brought forward by audiences in relation to programming more broadly, but I think there is a particular issue that people raise in relation to news and impartiality. That's absolutely right.
Speaking of audiences, I have to ask you what sort of audience you think the Lords will be for the Rwanda bill this afternoon. Do you think it could be a defeat for the Prime Minister?
Look, the Lords should take note of the fact that this passed through the House of Commons with a big majority. Obviously, that is something that the House of Lords should take into account. It would be really disappointing if the Labour Lords in the House of Lords vote against this bill. This is something that really matters to the British people. We have got a plan to deal with immigration, those illegal crossings, and it will be really disappointing if other parties thwart that.
OK, Secretary of State, we'll leave it there. Lucy Fraser is the Culture Secretary. And could we just apologise to you for placing you in the noisiest possible spot in the whole of London this morning. So well battled you. Well done for holding your own there. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.